Today we're at historic Locust Grove in Louisville, Kentucky. We'll be doing a special, this is a very special on-site episode today. I've got with me Brian Cushing. He's the program director here at this site, and our guest distiller is Alan Bishop, and he'll be directing the episode today. And what are we going to be making?
So we're going to be making historic Applejack style brandy is what we're going to be making today.
Apple brandy. So step number one, how do we get started?
Got to mash some apples.
So we're going to get started mashing some apples. So tell me about the mashing process versus grinding and why we're doing it with a stick, etc.
Yes, sir. So most of the early distilleries, especially the farm distilleries or even the smaller industrial style distilleries, they would have relied on as much of the primitive technologies as what they could, because they A, didn't have a lot of money to buy specialty tools, but B, on top of that, the distilling portion of what they did was secondary. It was ancillary to their farm work. So they're going to get away with putting as little into it as what they possibly could. So on the bottom end of the farm distilleries, you have this basic methodology, using a stick to break up apples. But then you can have anything up to a small apple grinder, or the people that had a little more money might even have like a nut mill or something of that nature with which they could grind their apples with. You might be familiar with modern apple brandy made from apple juice, obviously tying into apple cider. And you can make brandy that way. The style of brandy that we're going to be making today is actually what they call apple mash brandy. And the reason for the mashing over the cider is that you have a limited amount of time to work with when you're creating your brandy, and it takes 1 to 3 bushels of apples to make 1 gallon of brandy. So obviously much easier, much more efficient as far as the farm workers go to grind those apples up. And
so the real difference here is whether or not we squeeze those apples out or actually throw the apples and everything into the still, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so this Applejack style is like, hey, we're going to get this fermenting. We're going to let all this stuff stay. We're not going to strain it out. We're going to toss it all in the pot, right?
That's
so
correct.
That's the real difference.
Yep. And the big thing about that is too that in that time period, so the apple mash cider, the Applejack that was made, was actually considered a higher quality than general apple brandy, because you're actually in contact in the fermentation vessel with all the skin, all the things that make an apple an apple.
All the solids and everything.
You're extracting even more of the flavor of that apple.
Okay.
So brandy distillation is really about the concentration of the aromatics, okay? So the more of that you can hold on to, the more aroma you get, the more flavor you subsequently get. So with this apple mash brandy, it puts all those elements of the apple in contact with the yeast, which is going to convert sugar into ethanol. And subsequently, you're going to get more of the flavor of the apple from this type of mashing than you would from a juice.
So the more mashing though we get, the finer those particles are, the more it can work on it, the more flavors we extract. That's why we might want a real fine grind as much as possible.
Yes, exactly.
So Alan, these apples are all chopped up. They're nice and fine. What's our next step?
So our next step is we're going to come over here to our boiler. This is a 60-gallon copper boiler. And what we're going to do is we're going to boil some water, and we're going to use...
Obviously we got this boiling, so...
Yep, we're going to use that water then to cook the apples in, essentially. So
how are we going to do that?
So we're going to pour the water directly over top of the apples, and that's going to begin that cooking process, breaking down those cell walls, releasing all those sugars, and breaking down whatever starch is maybe left in that apple from storage. And at the same time, it's going to kill off any microorganisms that might otherwise interfere with our fermentation process. Of course, in the early days, those guys didn't know a whole lot about that.
Right. They just knew the best way to do it was this way.
Yeah, they didn't know how or why things worked. They knew how they worked. So just like our copper boiler, the reason that they used the copper was because it was reactive. So they knew that it would heat up faster than anything else that they had. The other thing it does is it captures different types of sulfur compounds, and it cleans up the water. It subsequently cleans up the fermentation, and the same reason that stills were made out of copper as well. So they would have noticed those reactions over time, but maybe not known why. So we are attempting to drop our temperature down to about 90 degrees. So that's where yeast likes to be happy at. And again, back in those days, most of the farmer distillers wouldn't have had a thermometer to check with. So it all would have been done by hand. So we are at about 90 degrees now, and we're going to pitch our yeast and begin the process of converting all those sugars.
How are they going to know what temperature that is?
Well, the yeast themselves, they talk amongst one another,
right?
And they have an idea. They go, "It's a little warm," It's like taking a bath.
Well, I mean, how are we going to find out what temperature?
How are we going to find out?
Period?
In that time period, essentially, you're just going to check it and make sure that it's nice and lukewarm. You don't want it overly warm. Pretty close to obviously your own body temperature.
Right. So 90, we want this a little less than blood warm, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yep. So once we pitch the yeast, that's going to kick off the process of fermentation. We're going to start converting all that sugar into ethanol and then also CO2. In a couple days, you're going to start seeing bubbles form and a cap form. Once the fermentation is done, two things you're going to notice is you'll be able to taste it, and you won't taste any of that sweetness anymore.
Okay.
And the other thing is when you pull your finger back out, you pull it out now, you can tell it's sticky. There's sugar there.
Right.
When it's finished, that sugar is not going to be there.
Right.
So the yeast,
it doesn't taste sweet because it's all that sugar's
it's all
gone.
been fermented. Yes. So the yeast that we're actually going to use is very particular to this style of brandy. So this is actually a yeast that comes from a distillery in southern Indiana called the McCoy Distillery. And that distillery made specifically Applejack brandy. That's all they made, Applejack and peach brandy.
Tell me how you got this yeast.
So we harvested this yeast. That distillery is the only distillery I know of in southern Indiana from those farm distillers that actually still has a building remaining, original wood and everything. So we made the equivalent of our mash here, and we set that around various locations in that old distillery. After 24 hours, we noticed that we had yeast working. All 4 of those samples fermented around the same time. They all smelled the same and they all tasted the same. So we presumed that they were all 4 the same or a very similar yeast that was dedicated to the production of alcohol.
Right.
So that yeast can live in that wood for hundreds of years. And pretty proud and pretty happy to have this particular yeast to put back into work in this style of brandy production.
Okay. So that's what you got. You're going to add to this.
Yes, sir. Yep.
So let's pitch it.
All right. So that's as simple as it sounds. We're just going to open our jug up and pour in. So I should also mention that depending on how involved those early distillers were, they may or may not have cultured their own yeast. We know the McCoys did because they had their own yeast jug. And a yeast jug was basically a way of propagating your yeast and maintaining it and keeping it. And generally they would keep 2 around. They would have one that traveled back and forth to and from the distillery from work with the distiller, and a second one that they would usually put somewhere like in a well where it was closed up so it would stay cold and no air would get to it, and they'd have it as a backup in case they ever lost their original strain. So what's going to happen now is this is going to work off in 6 to 7 days, essentially converting all that sugar to alcohol. After that 6 to 7 day period and we get this down to where there's no sugars left, we're going to take it and we're actually going to bucket brigade that into the still.
So this goes in the mash, the apple bits, everything goes straight into this.
Yes, sir. Yep. In the early days when they didn't have mechanized agitation in the still, you'd actually bucket into the still and you'd have somebody stirring inside the still until it got up to boiling. The other thing they often did is they would line the bottom of the still with straw. And what that does is it puts a layer in and keeps this from burning to the bottom of the still. So we would go into the still and do that double pot still distillation process. So when we're talking about that, what we're doing is essentially the first run on the still is we're bringing the temperature up to 172.3 degrees. Alcohol vapor rises, comes up to the cap and across the line arm, and over here out the worm. We're not doing anything to it to change it whatsoever, just capturing all the alcohol we can at about 50 to 60 proof roughly. We're going to capture all that and go back into the still, put that back into the still, 172.3 degrees, and we're going to make our cuts. So the first thing that's going to come off is going to be 4 shots. Almost all methanol. Second piece is going to be heads, so it's going to be like acetaldehyde, ethyl acetate. Smells a little like fingernail polish remover. We'll hold on to that, and that might get rerun into another batch later on because it doesn't accumulate over time. And then we're going to have our hearts, which is going to be what we actually want to drink, sell or trade. And then at about 90 proof to about 20, we're going to have our tails, where you have more water than you do ethanol. And it begins to get a little bit vegetative in flavor. Still good alcohol. We're going to save that, and that'll go into the next batch that we distill again to rectify it even more.
Brian Cushing has come all the way up from Locust Grove in Louisville, Kentucky with the finished product so we can try it out and see the stages we've got. Thanks for coming up, Brian.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
So what have we got here? You got a bunch of different bottles.
Yes. So since we can't actually distill on site, we went through the whole mashing process correctly in the video and all that, so it was ready to go. But since we're not a licensed distiller ourselves, we can't finish it out. So our one of our sponsors, a Kentucky Artisan Distillery in Crestwood, Kentucky, was kind enough to take the mash up to their facility and finish it out as kind of a research project for us. So they did the fermentation, they did the distillation, and even though they were using some modern equipment, they kept it as pure as they possibly could.
Same as what would have been done in the time period.
Right.
So you've got multiple things here. These are the stages.
Right. So this is all the different. These are the different cuts, and we've got a few different cuts here. We've got 2 of heads. And this is the toxic stuff. So that's the stuff you don't want to drink. And like Alan said in the video, I think, depending on how good the distiller was in the early 19th century, they might have cut this out or not. So this is not the stuff you want to consume. These are the hearts. This is the good stuff. And these are the tails. This stuff isn't going to hurt you, but it's also not, it doesn't taste that great either. So depending on the skill of the distiller, they might leave some of this in for some character, but not too much where it's going to throw it back.
And maybe mix some of these in either to, fill up the barrel or cut it out if it's the good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this ideally, this might be redistilled later in a different batch, but hopefully if you do your job right, it's not going into the final, into what you're actually going to drink. That's a headache waiting to happen.
Right. Okay, here's the finished product. Let's try this out. It does have a nice fruity aromatic to it right off the bat. So let's find out what it tastes like. I was expecting just a white liquor, just alcohol, but there's a lot more here.
Absolutely. I was surprised. I really was when we got to try it.
There are a lot of different flavors there, and I wasn't going to guess that I was going to get any apple out of this, really, but there is a apple aroma and some apple flavor there that's left in it. It's very mellow for something that's not aged. It's wow.
Well, this was, Alan's skill in the mashing, the orchard that helped us out with the apples, Kentucky Artisan Distilleries, their skill doing the distillation, and we all kind of got together and talked about it to kind of wrap up the research on this. A couple of the factors we figured played into that were the solids being left in while they distilled it, just like they would have been 200 years ago. And then the wine sap apples, especially that the orchard managed to get in there for us. And they got us a great selection of apples for this.
That is tremendous. Brian, thank you so much for bringing these up and inviting us to, participate in that whole brandy making process. We were there to mash the apples and all that stuff, so it was a lot of fun. If you are anywhere close to that Louisville, Kentucky area, make sure to check out historic Locust Grove. Such a great program that you've got there, and a lot of things going on. We'll make sure to put a link down in the description section, and I want to thank you guys for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.